Harlem, New York. In September 1932, Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson was 27 years old, already known to police and politicians, serving as the main power behind Harlem's policy gambling world while operating openly in his own neighborhood. Harlem was known as a place of sharp contrast. It was full of music, culture, and ambition, but also fear and pressure. Money moved through back rooms and street corners. White criminal groups pushed in from outside, while local people struggled to protect what little control they had left. Tension lived on every block, waiting for a spark. At the time, Bumpy Johnson was seen as one of the most dangerous men in Harlem, not because he was loud, but because he was calm. The environment rewarded patience, silence, and planning, punished emotion, public anger, and reckless action. Those who moved too quickly did not last long. By the early 1930s, Bumpy Johnson had established himself as the central figure in Harlem's numbers business. His name carried weight. People listened when he spoke, and they paid attention when he stayed quiet. A former numbers runner who had survived street violence, betrayals, and years of pressure, he carried himself with steady control. He did not rush. He did not explain himself. This calm made others uneasy, because they could never be sure what he was planning. Among Harlem's black policy operators and residents, Bumpy Johnson represented protection and pride in a system dominated by white criminal organizations. To many, he was not just a gangster, but a barrier against outsiders who took money, destroyed businesses, and left nothing behind. But not everyone respected Bumpy Johnson. One man in particular, Dutch Schultz, represented open danger. He did not move quietly. He moved with force, money, and fear. Where others tested limits, Schultz broke them. Dutch Schultz was a bootlegger and racketeer from the Bronx, known for violence, intimidation, and murder. His men beat policy operators, burned businesses, and killed those who refused to give up control. Schultz believed that power belonged to whoever took it first and held it hardest. He believed Harlem was weak and ready to be claimed. He had learned how to operate without punishment. Police did not stop him. Courts did not hold him. Each crime that went unanswered made him bolder. Dutch Schultz continued his expansion by using the weakness of the system around him. Police officers were paid to look away. Investigations slowed or disappeared. Witnesses were afraid to speak. Authority tolerated this because corruption was everywhere. Prohibition had filled the city with illegal money, and that money reached police, judges, and politicians. Stopping Schultz would have exposed too many people. Over time, Dutch Schultz came to believe he could not be touched. He moved openly, sent his men into Harlem without fear, and laughed at warnings. In his mind, the rules no longer applied to him. The first incident did not happen during violence or confrontation. It happened during routine business on an ordinary day in Harlem. Policy runners walked their usual routes. Shop owners accepted small bets the way they had for years. Nothing looked different at first. Then new men appeared. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They stood calmly on corners and outside storefronts that already belonged to Harlem operators. These men worked for Dutch Schultz. They spoke politely but firmly. They told operators that changes were coming. They offered to buy businesses for prices far below their real value. They spoke as if refusal was pointless. There was no gunfire, no broken windows, no blood on the street. But the message was clear. Harlem was being claimed. Bumpy Johnson heard about it quickly. He was told which streets were affected. He was told which men were involved. He understood exactly what Schultz was doing. This was not an accident. It was a test. Johnson chose not to respond. There were no orders given. No warnings sent. Schultz's men were not touched. They were allowed to leave and return again the next day. To people watching from the outside, this silence was confusing. Some believed Johnson was afraid. Others believed he was losing power. In a world where respect was enforced through action, stillness looked like weakness. Those closest to Bumpy Johnson expected a reaction. Harlem had seen violence for far less. A single insult had started wars before. But Johnson did nothing. This restraint was not uncertainty. It was control. He understood that reacting too early would give Schultz exactly what he wanted. Careless fight, a mistake, an excuse for greater force. Those who truly understood the streets recognized the pattern. They knew that silence did not mean surrender. It meant calculation. In Harlem, patience was often misunderstood. But those who survived long enough knew the truth. When a man waited this long, it meant he was preparing for something that could not be taken back. The next incident came weeks later on the streets of Harlem. This time, Dutch Schultz's men did more than stand and talk. They forced several policy operators to sell their businesses. The prices were unfair and the pressure was clear. Still, Bumpy Johnson remained silent. Not long after, another incident followed near Lenox Avenue. A local operator who refused to sell was beaten in public. People watched and said nothing. The message was meant to spread fear. Again, Johnson did not respond. A third incident came months later. One of Schultz's crews destroyed a small policy bank. Windows were broken. Records were burned. It was done at night, but everyone knew who was responsible. Johnson continued to wait. Then the violence became personal. A longtime Harlem operator was shot after refusing to give up control. His death was meant as a warning to others. Schultz's men believed they were winning. Johnson still held his position. Each incident made Dutch Schultz more confident. His men moved freely. They spoke louder. They believed Harlem was already theirs. In places like this, confidence becomes dangerous. Everything changed when the violence stopped being about business and became about domination. Schultz's organization began killing operators simply to remove fear and resistance. This crossed a line. Harlem was no longer dealing with pressure. It was facing destruction. Authority response was weak. Police reports were written. No arrests followed. The system stayed silent. From that moment, the outcome was no longer in question. That evening, Bumpy Johnson did not speak in public. There was no meeting hall, no crowd, no raised voice. He spoke quietly, in a private space, to a small group of men he trusted with his life. Outside, Harlem looked normal. Streetlights were on. Cars passed. People walked home from work. Nothing suggested that a turning point had already been reached. Inside, Johnson was calm. His face showed no anger. His voice did not change. He did not insult Dutch Schultz. He did not describe violence. He did not speak about revenge or pride. He spoke about what would happen next. He explained it simply. He said that the waiting was over. He said that Harlem could not continue the way it was. He said that the line had been crossed and could not be uncrossed. His words were clear, steady, and final. There was no threat in his voice. That was what made it unsettling. He was not asking for agreement. He was not seeking permission. He was stating a conclusion. Those listening understood immediately. They had known him for years. They recognized this tone. It meant there would be no turning back. No one interrupted him. No one asked questions. They did not need details. They understood their roles without being told. The decision had already been made long before this moment. When Johnson finished speaking, there was silence. Not fear. Not excitement. Just acceptance. The men left quietly, one by one. No one celebrated. No one spoke on the street. The plan did not need noise. Silence was part of it. That night, Harlem slept, unaware that the balance of power had already shifted. The setting of the final incident was ordinary. It was not hidden or secret. It was a public place used often for meetings, gatherings, and business. People had been there many times before. The room looked the same as it always did. Tables were set. Chairs were filled. Music played softly in the background. Conversations overlapped. Laughter rose and fell. Nothing stopped. Nothing paused. Men continued drinking. Servers moved through the room. No one cleared the space. No one locked the doors. The routine continued exactly as it always had. That was what made the moment powerful. No warning came with it. No signal was given. It arrived inside normal life. Dutch Schultz believed this setting protected him. Public spaces made him feel untouchable. Witnesses meant restraint. Familiar surroundings made danger feel distant. The people in the room did not know they were about to witness history. To them, it was just another meeting, another night, another business conversation. Bumpy Johnson entered without drama. He was not rushed. He did not draw attention. He walked the way he always did. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then routine broke. And because everything before had been so normal, what followed could never be forgotten. Dutch Schultz chose to escalate in public. He did it openly, in front of men who worked for him and men who worked for others. He spoke loudly enough to be heard. His tone carried confidence, not caution. He made it clear that he did not take Bumpy Johnson seriously. He laughed at the idea that Harlem could be taken from him. He spoke as if the warning meant nothing. He treated it as a joke, something said by a man who did not understand how power truly worked. This time there was no ambiguity. The insult was not hidden. It was not indirect. It was meant to be seen and remembered. Schultz wanted witnesses. He wanted people to believe he could not be challenged. The room reacted slowly. Some men looked away. Others watched closely. Everyone understood that this moment mattered. Bumpy Johnson did not respond with words. He stood. He rose from his seat without hurry. His face did not change. His posture was steady. The simple act of standing shifted the room. Noise faded. Movement slowed. In that moment, everyone present knew the waiting had ended. According to witnesses, everything happened in seconds. There was no shouting, no confusion. Each movement was controlled and exact. Men moved where they had already planned to move. No one acted by accident. The action was fast but not wild. It was not fueled by anger. It was the result of preparation. Before anyone could step in, before police or authority could respond, the outcome was already set. What needed to happen had happened. When it was over, there was no celebration, no chaos. Silence returned quickly, heavier than before. Those who saw it understood they had witnessed a turning point. Not because of how loud it was, but because of how final it felt. Nothing could return to the way it had been. Bumpy Johnson stopped immediately. There was no confusion about it. When the moment ended, he did not move forward or backward. He did not look for another opening. He did not press his advantage. He simply stopped. This was not fear. It was control. People nearby expected chaos. They expected shouting, panic, or resistance. None of that came. Johnson stood calmly, breathing steady, as if he had already moved past the moment everyone else was still trying to understand. Authority arrived quickly. Police officers pushed through the space, weapons drawn, voices raised. Orders were given. Johnson did not challenge them. He did not argue about fairness. He did not ask questions. He followed instructions. His hands were visible. His body was still. The officers placed him under control, and he allowed it to happen. There was no struggle, no delay, no need for force. Before he was taken away, Johnson spoke one final line. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. He did not try to explain himself. He did not insult anyone. The words were simple and calm, delivered without emotion. Those close enough to hear understood immediately. The line was not meant to provoke. It was meant to close the moment. Then he was removed. The room stayed silent long after he was gone. Dutch Schultz survived, but survival did not mean victory. Something had changed, and everyone could feel it. His name still carried weight, but it no longer carried certainty. His men no longer moved with the same confidence. They watched corners more carefully. They spoke less. In Harlem, behavior shifted almost overnight. Collectors stopped showing up in places they once claimed. Trucks that once arrived on schedule stopped coming. Meetings were canceled. Orders were delayed. Some men left the neighborhood quietly and did not return. Violence slowed. Not because peace had been declared, but because lines had been drawn. People did not need speeches or explanations. They understood what had happened. They understood what it meant. Bumpy Johnson did not need to repeat himself. The message had already traveled faster than words ever could. Harlem adjusted, and so did everyone who hoped to control it. When the events were later reviewed, A clear pattern appeared. The trouble did not begin suddenly. It built over time. First came small moves, then stronger pressure, then open violence. Each step followed the last. Warnings had been given. They were not loud, but they were clear. Silence was mistaken for fear. Patience was read as weakness. That mistake shaped everything that followed. The system failed at every level. Complaints were ignored. Violence went unpunished. Corruption slowed action. Authority reacted only after control had already shifted. When officials looked back, the conclusion was unavoidable. This outcome was not an accident. It was the result of repeated escalation, ignored warnings, and a system that allowed power to operate without limits. Long after the incident, the story continued to circulate. It was told quietly. It was passed from one person to another, not because of drama or excitement, but because it carried meaning. People remembered how patience had been misunderstood, how silence had been mistaken for surrender, how waiting had been confused with fear. In places like this, restraint is not weakness. It is often the final warning. Power reveals itself not in noise, but in the moment when patience ends and action becomes unavoidable.